Within the university framework, the universities value Australian Research Council dollars much more than they value dollars from the research and development corporations focused on agriculture. Why? Because the Australian Research Council applies to all fields. You can't use the RDC funding if you don't have an agriculture faculty or if you don't have any concentration of effort in that area. So as a metric, and metrics are what we measure our university by these days. Metrics, it's simple. We measure our universities against their ARC success. We don't measure them against their RDC success. But these are simple things that also relate, obviously, to the very nature of Australian society. Australian society over the last 20 years has changed enormously. We are more urban. In every way, the disconnect with the rural countryside is greater than ever. We have far more of our economy is now in the tertiary sector than it is in the primary sector. But we've got still the national interest to consider. So in much of what I'm pushing here today, I'm saying to you, refocus on the national interest, and this will help our long-term education efforts. Universities are, of course, interesting places. As a dean of one of the leading faculties of agriculture in Australia, and as many of you know, we've had plenty of interesting headlines from the University of Sydney in recent times. Universities, though, just reflect society as a whole. The composition of the University of Sydney, as an example, reflects the boom in medical research, the boom in business studies, booms in IT. All of these things have happened and will go on happening. There'll be another boom in some other field round the corner. But the universities have funding models, and funding models is what we live by. The funding model is not determined solely from within the university, it's determined from Canberra. And so the funding that we get for every agriculture student is woefully inadequate. The funding that's available for every vet science student is woefully inadequate for the cost of actually turning out those graduates. This, though, is not an area where anyone is likely to make any headway with any government in the next few years. Governments of both colours, both colours, know that they don't have the money to pay for the full cost of educating a graduate in agriculture, in vet science, medicine, many fields. They know that, and those of you who will have seen the University of Sydney Vice-Chancellor on Q&A this week, and will have seen his very direct questioning of his future boss. You might question the questioning, given that he was talking to his future boss, but I think the point was clear. He was saying that education is still the single best investment a country can make in its future, and sure, government is all about setting priorities. Why don't you put education higher in the list of priorities? The answer, I think, as most of us might have expected, was it ain't going to happen. There isn't going to be the money. So asking governments for more to produce an agriculture graduate is really an empty question. We know the answer is not going to be positive in the current in the foreseeable future. This is just an economic reality. So what we're going to need to do is to mobilise the sources from outside of government. We are going to need the industry right through the supply chain, right from the big retailers, to recognise that food's not going to be made available without a vibrant education process. There will not be the graduates. We're going to need to go back to things like I started out talking about, which are cadetships. We are going to need cadetships. We're going to need internships. Internships are a win-win. Internships where industry simply says ahead of time, right, we will provide 10 internships a year for students in their summer holidays. We used to call this vacation work. It was what you did to keep the wolf from the door. Repackage it, call it an internship. The students put it down on their CV. Oh, I did 6 weeks internship with the Colonial Sugar Refinery. And then someone said, who? But the reality is we need to do it smarter. We can repackage things that we've done for years, call them internships, advertise them, commit to them ahead of time. That brings the students into the program right at the start. We've got to stop schools from aligning agriculture with vocational training. This is a very difficult area because in many rural parts of New South Wales and other states, agriculture is treated as the thing you do if you're not smart enough to go further. We've got to stop that. We've got to treat agriculture in the same way as we treat mathematics or chemistry or biology. Agriculture has to become part of the smart nation approach that we're going to need. And this is a big piece of work. I know it's easy to say that the embedding of agriculture as a subject, along with hairdressing and bricklaying, does agriculture no favours whatsoever in secondary education. Asking governments to take bipartisan approaches is again something in recent times that is really wishing for the impossible. And Australia is a funny place in this particular space, partly because, almost unique among Western democracies, we have a party, the National Party, that uniquely represents a rural voting public. You wouldn't get away with treating agriculture the way we treat it in Australia in the United States, for example. Both parties know they have to treat agriculture with respect. But in Australia, one side of politics figures, well, that's always the other side. So, do we need to focus on it? Not really. We know we're going to get a belting. In recent years, of course, political winds have changed. There's been all sorts of strange things happening in rural seats. So perhaps that will change in future. But we will, I think, for the foreseeable future, remain a country where we have limited periods of time, given our political system, where agriculture is going to be at the forefront of thinking of government. So it's vital that we recognise it, work with it, and make sure that we get in when the going's good to get the sorts of changes needed that agriculture understands are needed. So a bipartisan approach, sure, but we're going to need to make every post a winning post in the next few years. So when we come back to the core issues around education, universities have an important role, not just because we're part of the process, but also because we act as a gatekeeper. The reality is now that the future careers in agriculture, the skills that are needed, the agronomists that we need, now, we, the universities, act as a gatekeeper by setting standards in terms of entry requirements for university degrees. We affect what happens at high schools.